If you are here, you must have come to the right channel. This game that follows is from the current Top Chess Engine Championship of Season 19. The two finalist engines that made it to this stage are Stockfish and LC0. Round 10 is in progress, so fresher than this you will not get. The superfinal between Stockfish and LC0 is a 100-game match. Stockfish White starts from this position using a 4-move book. E4 was met by E5, and here we have the King's Gambit. The King's Gambit is not in fashion, but there is no better way to see how the best two engines of this season play it. The Gambit was accepted. Stockfish introduced this knight into the game to stop the Queen's access to H4, and with G5 Muzio style, after NC3 and D6, the engines are out of book. Stockfish opted for the center with this move, and LC0 went for a variation that was used by Quaade. The engine came up with this attack. The knight can easily back off, but Stockfish opts for a far riskier approach to the game. This pawn was removed, and what we have already on move 6 is this knight offering on F3. Was this a miscalculation on behalf of Stockfish? With the knight being immediately removed, Stockfish used the queen to capture, and at the cost of an entire knight. How this opening works is to just look what we have visually. Black has a near-zero development and white has the knight that is very well positioned, two central pawns that look incredibly strong in the center, and of course this queen on F3. With LC0 introducing this knight on C6, Stockfish applied this pin, and with BD7 in a way forced, here we get to see Stockfish's first type of trick. The engine opted for this queen move to F2. Stockfish does not want to keep the queen on the light squares to avoid NF6 and then the potential attack on the queen using the bishop. If white were to castle long, then this bishop on G4 would be able to inflict damage and get rid of the rook on D1. After bishop G7, Stockfish pushed on with this pawn, and the idea is to open up the center. If these two pawns come off, should LC0 develop this knight, after Stockfish gets the king to safety, should LC0 castle on the other side of the board, what happens if you apply this pin? QE8 is probably met by this bishop repositioning, and black will be very happy with the way this opening is played. When this pawn advanced to E5, LC0 does not capture but opted for this knight development. Stockfish followed this one through with this pin, and here we have this new type of move. LC0 got rid of this pawn, but rather than capture immediately, Stockfish calculates a far more intriguing variation. It jumped the knight into this square and is expecting this queen on D8 to shift the C8. LC0 is in no rush to make a hasty move, and yet it had already something calculated, quite an impressive variation. Not all variations are impressive, but this one by definition has to be. It wasn't queen C8, it wasn't A6 to attack this bishop, and it wasn't H6 to attack this bishop on the king side. In just 1 second, no more, this is the move the engine went for. This stuff is only seen in engine games. What engine hangs the queen in return for a knight? It is not exactly for a single knight. With Stockfish grabbing hold of the queen, when LC0 captured this rook, this is the score. LC0 has just offered the queen for 2 minor pieces, but this variation does not end here. With another pawn coming off, finally LC0 gets to castle, and with Stockfish doing exactly the same thing, this rook came under fire. Rook E1 led to this resource just to be able to support this knight on C6 in the likely case the bishop wants him. For sure, if this was the idea, it's no longer. There is no need to trade the bishop for the knight when this knight on E7 can easily support his twin brother. King B1, getting his king away from any unwanted check via H6, led to this bishop to come under fire. Bishop back to C4, got this attack going, and this pawn on E5 is extremely hard to cover. There are 3 minor pieces attacking him, and this pawn has only the rook to support him. In short, if LC0 wants this pawn, Stockfish has no viable way of covering him. Stockfish tried to confuse Leela by attacking this bishop. Leela gladly accepted the challenge, and by having gone for this guy on E5, if this pawn is removed, this knight will also be able to get rid of this bishop. Though a queen up, the opposition, if you like, has a tremendously strong attack. If you go for something like this, what would happen if you come chasing after this queen? QC5 doesn't work because of this takes with a check, and with the king escaping here, this is what you are looking to accomplish. Support the 2 knights with this jump, and Stockfish is already in trouble. When the bishop was attacked, this is how the engine played it. It removed this guy as we saw earlier, but when it come to the next move, Stockfish backed off this bishop to safety, and in turn LC0 does this same with this bishop too. A3, which is a rather difficult move to explain, got this guy going too, and again, this move is not easy to explain either. Rook D1 challenging the opposing rook, but LC0 is not interested. Should the engine trade, it would only help the opposition develop an otherwise rook that had no real voice in this game. So with the engine chosen to retain the rook, Stockfish brings the other rook into the game, and with H6 and Rook D2, the idea is to join up the rooks on this file. With this pawn making it to the fifth, if you are looking for a rather strange move, this has to be it. This is how Stockfish plays it, and it provokes or aims to provoke a response. Do you go for a knight move to expose this rook, or this is what Stockfish was expecting? Should you opt for this attack, removing this rook from the equation will be met by this check on f7, and if it's not the rook coming off, Stockfish can always do something else. King h7 will have this rook come off, and Leela falls apart. The bishop is up next, but there are hidden threats too. What happens if you allow this check using the bishop? It's a recipe for disaster. The best you can do after this rook is removed, to go on and eliminate this rook on d4. Do this with the knight, get rid of this rook, and when the knight captures this rook, now you can move in with this takes check, and is still game over. There are 4 minor pieces up against the queen and a bishop, but with more pawns that are bound to come off, this is by no means savable for Leela. When this rook came in with this provocative response, Leela prepared this rook repositioning. Leela right now has offered a queen for 2 minor pieces, so where is the compensation? There doesn't appear to be any, but is this a message to say the engine doesn't need to queen to win a game? So far we can't work out if any engine has a winning position, but since 9 games were played already in this superfinal, the likelihood of a draw is extremely high. When Stockfish applied this pressure through this queen response, this is how Leela responded. Her aim is to try and influence the position of this bishop on b3. So we are looking for a very likely a4, but with the bishop able to escape, has this attack got any real meaning? Rook d5 trying to add all the pressure on this knight, led to the attack on this bishop, and with him backing off to the only safe spot he had, do you support this pawn on the queen side, and if so, how? Leela protected him with this bishop repositioning, and through this rook joining up with his other twin brother, Leela does exactly the same thing. Queen f2, and we have a switch in tactics. With the pressure being released from this knight on e5, LC0 chose to back off this knight, and through this move, Leela attacks this rook. Rook back to d2, got this move going, and Leela is looking to push along with these queenside pawns. Stockfish tries to take advantage of this rook repositioning to c8 and chooses to hunt after this rook. This rook can easily be covered by simply repeating. However, what we saw was something far more exuberant. Leela not only covers the rook in this way but also hunts after the queen. Stockfish had to get this queen to go somewhere, and finally this is where it chose to place her. Leela is in lockdown. This bishop on a2 is nothing but trouble. It keeps a number of pieces hostage. This pawn on f7 is pinned. The 2 knights support each other. The engine was forced in a way to support pawns on the queen side, and this bishop in the diagonal is strictly speaking on defensive duties. Let alone the engine is missing the queen. Stockfish's position is far more interesting. LC0 chose to reposition the king, and this is the only way to start making progress. Stockfish did exactly the same thing, as if engines can get jealous of each other's moves. When Leela went for a consecutive king move, Stockfish repositions the queen again, and this is the point where Leela starts to repeat. It went for a repeat king move and may be very keen to see a repetition. Why would the engine choose to jump into this pin when it just got out of it? After rook d6, things were about to get ugly. Rook back to e8, got this rook to lift to the 4th, and if this position is not complex enough, this is how Leela makes it to become even more complicated. This knight move protects this bishop on d7 without having to get this knight on e5 to come to the rescue. This knight on e5 is also need to be able to protect this pawn on f7. With Stockfish going for a U-turn with this rook, this is how you get a feel that we might get to see a draw. When Leela decided she had enough of this ugly-looking bishop on the rim, she challenged him. With Stockfish having no problem trading, through this capture, many pieces were going to come off. With another 2 rooks coming off, Stockfish applied this pin. There is a potential attack on the queen using the rook, but in the end, Leela chooses this course of action. It was another king move to the edge of the board. h4, got this king going again, and if Leela was looking to find a way to win, she is blowing her own position up. King right into a2, got the knight to jump right into this outpost, and when the rook applied this pin, Leela is in no rush to complicate matters. This is what she does. In terms of points, each engine has exactly the same count. If the pawns and the rooks are cancelled out, with the queen up against 3 minor pieces, there is a strong argument that it might be Leela that has the better chances of winning. Rook e4, got once again Leela to opt for this king move, and if this is not a strong sign of wanting a draw, nothing is. Queen h3, got this knight to back off, and with Stockfish coming in with yet another queen repositioning, Leela repositions the knight here. Rook f4, got this bishop to back off, and however Stockfish tries to rearrange its own pieces, Leela has all the answers ready. Rook back to f1, and this is what you call a shot in the dark. Knight f6, got the rook to sneak into this outpost, but with the knight blocking his access to the back rank, this game is not likely to go anywhere. Queen f2, got Leela to go for yet another king move, and if you observe what is going on, Leela is very strategically positioned. The engine has all her pieces covered to perfection, and it doesn't appear the queen is needed to defend. Having said this, the engine without the queen is defending. So why hand her over for 2 minor pieces, particularly when she is not able to gain any advantage from letting her go? Queen g3, got the king to move out, and this game is likely to last far longer than we might have expected. With these 2 moves repeating, it appears Leela is the engine that is coming up with a deviation. Through this bishop repositioning, she avoids the 3-fold repetition, so why do this when the engine thinks is not better off? Rook e1, got Leela to walk her king again, and through this rook move and king 4th to the 7th rank, this is how the moves are adding up pretty fast. King b1 says it basically all. Knight back to c7, led to this check, but how effective is this, and how credible is this check? King h7, and queen to the rim, led to this knight to back off. If a result is to be reached, some engine would need to take at least some risk. With Stockfish having chosen for this pawn push, once again Leela goes it extremely passively. She went for yet another king move, and now we are probably looking at a game moving beyond the 100 move mark. Another problem both engines might have is time. Both are running low on time, but when was it last time we saw either Stockfish or Leela get flagged? When Stockfish pushed on with this pawn, 2 more pawns came off, and finally we might have a development. With this bishop being under fire, Leela doesn't even bother to cover him. She went for this attack, and only when the rook backed up, it was time for this bishop to do the same. King back to a2, got this knight going, and through this rook response, Stockfish is going to the big attack. Through this rook move, Leela deliberately allowed this check, but when the king moved to safety, after this queen repositioning, Leela blocks the queen's access to the back rank. Rook e1, got the rook to return to the back rank. Stockfish pinned this pawn. And now through this rook repositioning, this game is not only very hard to cover, but it now has become very fast too. Rook e8, got this attack going, this rook reached the 6th rank, and via this rook move, Leela stops the queen's access anywhere near the bishop. When the moves began to somehow repeat, is it no longer viable to even try and cover this game from this point on? This was shot in the dark, and now it is backfiring. Don't be surprised if this game runs into the 200 move mark. Through these responses, anything Stockfish is trying to create is just nullified by Leela. When it came to this position, with Leela being reluctant to trade, this is how the game carries on. No point to even analyze what follows, so let's run through the moves in the hope that we shall see an end coming soon. When finally this rook was challenged, Leela trades here, but if there is way to stop this pawn on the king side, this game is going to end by sharing the point. A check got the king to back off, and via this queen repositioning, king f8 got this check in, and with the moves basically repeating, Leela sneaks this bishop into this outpost. King out of his box got this bishop to reposition again. When the checks continued, this attack on the bishop was hopeless in a way. bishop all the way back to safety, led to this arrangement, and right now this ending is going to be painful. If only engines would feel the pain, this would be painful for both. Stockfish has no way of winning this game, and in fact it would be easier to trap the queen than any one of these three minor pieces. Again, through these responses, provided you have everything covered, Leela has nothing to fear about. The engines are squeezing out every single move to the second, but are we going to see anyone get flagged? With every single move made, Leela makes sure every single minor piece is fully covered. Keep an eye out on how these two knights are not bound to budge, and with everything being covered, this has to end in a draw. When Stockfish came up with this king walk to the c1, Leela tried this trick, but it was impossible for any engine to fall for it. If you remove this bishop, when this fork appears, it would be wise to say, it is game over. Stockfish checked here, and many moves are beginning to repeat. Through this rearranging, it is like pieces are dancing around the board, but everything down to the very last pawn is covered. Move after move after move. Despite the few repetitions, this game in the end finished in a draw. These are the remaining moves by each engine. With Stockfish trying his last chance, when these two pawns also came off. This had to be it, and yet the engines went on and on. Every time this bishop was chased after, Leela covered him, and with this fortress, any probability that an engine would mess up, would be coming down to time. Both engines came very close to losing on time, and with Leela coming down to her last second, she then used every inch of the increment to see her through. This game finally ended in a draw in a 213-move nightmare. It is the longest superfinal game to date, but it is surprising to see this when especially the previous game using the same opening, ending in only 46 moves. This one too ended in a draw. In short, this has not been a good start, but this is the risk of covering games as they take place. One thing for sure, no one would dare cover this game, so here we have it. Our first game featured was a total disaster, and these are the risks associated with covering games as they are currently being played. I have large doubts you enjoyed it, but that queen sacrifice was at least an hair-raising experience. Engines often go for strange lines, but this particular game using the Quaade opening in the King's Gambit Accepted has been in a way interesting, and this is despite its ending. Once the queen came off, the game also died down. Maybe more to come. For now, it's a big goodbye and look forward to seeing you next time.